I'm going to try to actually help and make my short presentation now, which might help slightly organize this range of capacities issues by noting, first of all, that we are inhabiting multiple temporalities at the same time, which is something that Gilberto was referring to, the issue of staying within, so to speak, the eye of the hurricane, as well being outside, and how do you apply and what kind of capacities and perceptive abilities are you capable of applying in a certain situation, as well as refer to Roberto's discussion of a whole range of anticipatory practices and methodologies that are essentially strung along multitude of and multi-layered temporality. So I would just like to propose a couple of things that I proposed in my abstract for the conference, which is that on one hand, I wanted to address the nature of anticipation as a paradoxical issue of prospecting the future for the present. And that is what Roberto was referring to have that forward-looking attitude, which I understand he's also speaking of a somewhat hopefully more hopeful and positive attitude, and also using that attitude for bettering the conditions of the present. That's why I said prospecting the future for the present, which is a complex and paradoxical thing to do. And the second aspect of what I've tried to tackle in that proposal is to outline two general modalities of future, in future making, so to speak, and they're correlating anticipatory methods. In anticipatory methods, I understand as particular mode of anticipation and vision of future that it engenders, as always, as Hazel pointed out, context, position, as well as power contingent. So what I proposed is a particular theoretical outlook on sociocultural trends, as well as terms for their understanding via two modalities of future generating, which by no means are supposed to be polarized or reductive as two, but just to kind of offer two flows, two modalities, two waves that also interfere with each other and affect each other, but to help the discussion, hopefully. The first I called strong future or strong futuring, which is a more immediate, more observable and predictable, depends on technological means of accessibility, accumulation, and analysis of data that allows for projection, forecasting, and for trend setting, which is something that mostly, say, Tibor or Donato spoke about the risk management, planning, decision-making, as we are immersed in the immediate needs and the exigencies of daily life of disastrous circumstances. But it is also something that is focused on identification of threat, which Gilberto then tried to expand by talking about planetary threat, Hazel or Gilberto in particular. So who is the threat and what are the actual issues of security as we are dealing with paradoxical problems of having internal threats as well as planetary threats. So this is, it is strong future because its presence is strongly felt. We tend to feel also strongly about our projections, even though Hazel pointed out that there have been, courageous voices, warning voices that have been neglected for so long or, denied. So we generally tend to feel strongly about our projections as they're based on registered factors and methodologies available, even as we're trying to expand those methodologies. And next to that kind of anticipatory mode, I put something that I termed, mind you, it's not opposite from strong. It is actually something I called slow futuring, or slow future, which tends to be less immediately observable, but nonetheless undergoing, and with long-term effect, like an underground current that is shaping the relief from underneath in ways that are not immediately observable, but nonetheless shifting terrain and shaping relief over a longer period of time. So this is also tends to be happening exactly in the forces or in the parts of population that are affected by slow violence, long-term accumulation of violence, typically over their bodies and their immediate physical conditions and threatening their vitality. So the evolutionary long-term impact of the slow futuring is tends to have longer processual accumulative effects, while the first one, the strong futuring, is one more of a trend setting, has a more of a trend setting outcome. I see these two modalities as ways of sensing, as well as making sense, and they consequently shape the attitudes we have to the self, to the other, resources, and environment. So rather than polarities, dichotomies, and inversions, they are concurrent, interrelated, mutually productive, and they engage different shapes of anticipation modes on the spectrum from certainty to uncertainty. So connecting what Roberto and Gilberto were talking about, from prediction to forecasting to foresight to invention and to envisioning. And I hope to drive that towards Andras Laszlo's presentation, as well as Pierre and Philip's presentation, which I'm sure will be focused more on envisioning. So we have a nice development of our topic. So on one hand, we have dissipatory practices employ different relationships to and attitudes towards future. So I would like to bring in the question of anticipation and anticipatory capacities as a matter of relationship. One sense is future as something in waiting, there to be decoded and prepared for, more of an event, and an out there, engaged in a more reactive or corrective manner, ameliorating conditions, bettering conditions. The other sense is the future is something in making, not in waiting, but rather in making, there to be created and brought forth, more of an experience, and an in here, engaged in more proactive and transformative matter. It's kind of a more creative process. It is in between these two anticipatory modes that I situate the generative space for unlocking the potential of the present. And I would like to, I go on in my presentation to discuss what kind of human beings do we need to be, what kind of capacities do we have to develop to be able to have this kind of perceptive complexity. But this was my contribution to the discussion, trying to open up possibility for anticipation being something on a range and a relationship and processual process, a processual dynamics of it. But I would like to add to it one particular thing in particular terms to this discussion, the notion of event versus experience, which could help us out. So that I point out that between the event and experience could be that generative space of the potential of the present. Event is something that happens, and experience is the interpretation of the event translated into knowledge. So via science, via art, worldview, and it requires disciplined methodologies, analytical or creative means, and imaginative. Anticipatory faculties are actually psycho-emotional aptitude, and they could be cultivated through, from this interstice between event and experience, and utilized as an aperture, that is, as an opening into the bigger present, again, for expanding its evolutionary potential. I would like to point out that that process of translation and interpretation is largely aesthetic, and it involves development of emotional and social intelligences, intuitive capacities, and imagination, unleashing that imagination that Roberto pointed out or pointed toward. So this is a paradoxical process that involves a double process of rewriting or imagining back of the past, and simulatory living out of the future already. It's a kind of an uncanny experience and paradoxical reinvention of agency by remaking the past anew and living out the future already. So this between an event and experience is an aesthetic process, an act of representation, translation, and sense-making that is narrativization and storytelling, of which and toward which Hazel and Gilberto pointed out as well. So the processes that become part of personal collective history, identity, way of knowing, relating, informative of development of transferable knowledge, which this kind of sense-making becomes a process of representation of values, people, and aspiration, and as such, it is translated into the domain of the political as institutionalized process of representation. So consequently, I am pointing toward a possibility that the evolutionary potential of the present and the question of anticipation is situated exactly between the aesthetic and the political. And this is where I will leave it as kind of a provocative opening and an aperture of which I've spoken. for further discussion. But I hope I have brought in something to the table that can maybe hold the anticipatory range for us.